Hey NBA 2K fans, in this video we're going to talk about whether you should use auto versus manual subs and give you some tips on using both of them, whatever you decide to do. If you're new to the channel, I'm Coach 2K, and while you're here, click subscribe, click the bell to get notified whenever I upload any new NBA 2K video so you don't miss any of my tips or my league series videos that I'm doing. And with that, let's get started and talk about substitutions and how you might want to do them in NBA 2K. First thing I want to talk about is how to turn auto or manual subs on or off, and how you do that is you go into the coaching settings. You can see here I'm in the options menu, and under coach settings, if I go down to substitution, I have two choices, auto or manual. And so once you decide what you're going to set it up at, that's where you find that particular setting within the game. The difference between these two settings is that if you have it on auto, the CPU will decide all the substitutions for you. And if you put it on manual, then the CPU won't make any subs for you until you sub somebody in. And that's the difference between the two settings. So auto means the CPU takes care of everything. Manual means you got to decide who comes in and out. In addition to setting it outside of any game mode, I also go inside the game mode itself, and I set it within the coach settings of that particular mode. So for example, here I'm in my league, and then inside my league I go down to substitution, and I either turn that to auto or manual there depending on what I want to do. And even though I set the settings outside of a game, when I start a game, I always go into the coach settings. So I'll pause the game and go in and just verify that everything's set up right, because sometimes things don't stick. So I'll go into coach settings and just make sure that it's either on auto or manual the way I want it. So just an extra tip there, I always just double check everything at the beginning of the game, and most people are okay with you just making a couple changes right at the beginning of the game to verify some stuff, and that's what I do. And just about everybody I play kind of goes in and verifies they have things that they want set up the way they want them before the game gets underway, so you don't have to do it once it's started. Regardless of whether you have auto or manual subs turned on or off, the first thing you're going to want to make sure is that whoever's starting for you is set up properly. So in a My League file here, like I'm in the My League file, I can go under coach game plan and set global and team specific game plans. And I'd want to make sure that, for example, if I wanted to start Sabonis at power forward instead of Young, that I would have that set up here so that when the game starts, I've already got the rotation, the starters set up the way that I want them. Because a lot of times a game will start and you'll go, oh crap, I didn't realize I had Young starting, I wanted Sabonis to start. So before the game even starts, you want to make sure that you have the starters set up the way you want them. And so like in the My League, that's how you do it. I guess I should mention that if you're in a My League, just to go back to that for a second, that just because you're changing in all teams, I always double check the team specific starters just to make sure that it's carried over. So just as a backup, before you start the game, go into the team specific lineup area and check that out too before you begin, just to be safe. Another thing that I always do is go into player health before the game and just double check and make sure nobody's hurt on either team, because sometimes, especially in the My League online situation where we weren't wanting injuries to be in effect, somebody will be hurt and then that person won't start or whatever. So just as a backup, I always suggest going in there just to double check before you begin to make sure your starters and stuff are going to come in. If you happen to be playing somebody online or in a play now situation outside of My League, then when you get to the edit lineup screen, that's where you're going to want to verify that who you want to start is starting. And if you need to make a change and put somebody in that's, you want starting instead of letting the CPU decide, this is where you'd want to do that. So as you start a game, you want to make sure the lineups are where you want them, either before you go into the game, like if it's a My League file, or at the edit lineup screen when you start to play somebody. Okay, now that the starters are established, I wanted to kind of talk about some things to consider if you're going to be a manual substitution player. So once the starters are established, then we're talking about these bench guys and when they're going to come in. Now, if you're using a real life team, and one approach you can take to rotations is to kind of do what they do in real life, to mimic the coach in real life. So let's say that Nate McMillan, who's the coach of the Pacers right now, decides that he brings Sabonis in for Young at the 5-minute mark of the first quarter. Well, then as you're playing, you'd want to make that substitution at around the same time. So you could use the real life substitution patterns if you want. Now, if you don't want to necessarily do it that way, what you could do is you could kind of plot out your rotations kind of like a little rotation timeline like the game gives you, but just kind of offline on a piece of paper, so that you have certain players playing with the groups that you want them to play with. And so if you want to pre-plan your rotations, you want to kind of sit down and think about that outside the game, and then kind of have it already thought out who you want to come in for who, when you want them to come in, who you want to finish the game, what you're going to do if a player gets hot. And so those are some things to consider as far as rotations are concerned, and how you want to bring players in if you want to follow some sort of rotation timeline method. The next consideration you'll want to make if you're a manual substitution player is you're going to want to watch the energy level during the game. So the energy level here at the beginning of the game is 100, but let's say Miles Turner is playing Joel Embiid or somebody else, and I'm not sure if Embiid has the bruiser badge or not, but somebody who's just physically more is stronger than Turner is probably going to get tired more easily. So you're going to want to keep tabs on that during the game and substitute accordingly. Now, that also means that you're going to want to take your timeouts when you need to, so you can rest players when they need it, not just by putting them on the bench, but also by calling key timeouts at situations to keep them rested throughout the game. Some people won't call any timeouts, and if you're doing that, you could be using players that might be a little more tired than they need to be. So keep fatigue in mind if you're doing manual subs. The next consideration if you're manually subbing is foul trouble. If somebody gets in foul trouble, you're going to want to sub them out manually. And so let's say that Oladipo got 2 quick fouls early. Well, then I'm going to want to take him out. Now this along with fatigue really is going to be a function of the number of minutes that you play your games on. So in my case, I'm always a 12-minute quarter player, and so fouls and fatigue, that matters more than if you're playing like a 6-minute quarter game, because you don't have to worry about it as long. But you're going to want to keep track of fouls as you go through the game and take people out as you need to if somebody's in foul trouble. The next thing you're going to want to kind of pay attention to is matchups on the floor. There might be situations where a player is being taken advantage of in a way that he's weak. So like Bogdanovich, not a very good post defensive player. And so if I'm playing the Celtics and Tatum is posting up Bogdanovich every time down the floor, well, I might want to consider subbing out Bogdanovich and putting somebody in who might be a little bit better defender in the post to kind of account for that matchup problem. Now, in addition to an individual matchup problem, there are also going to be situational times during the game where maybe you're going to want to have a certain lineup out on the floor. And what's kind of nice in my league is that you can set up situational lineups based on certain situations. So for example here, if it's the end of the game and I want to put a free throw line up out there, these are my best free throw shooters. So I could instantly choose the free throw lineup and throw them in. That way, situationally, I know I got that covered. Maybe it's a situation where I need a 3-point lineup, or I want a defensive lineup. And so you can have those things kind of predetermined who you want to put in. Now, just because these say bench and tall and quick and defense and so on, doesn't mean you got to use them that way. Another way you could use these situational on-the-fly lineups is just by, let's say the first substitution pattern you want to have in is, maybe like in our case with Sabonis coming in at the 5-minute mark, maybe that would be set up so that this would be that rotation, the starters plus Sabonis. maybe the next rotation time that I want to make a substitution. That way it could kind of quicken things up when I'm doing my manual subbing if I have these situational lineups set for rotational situations, and I just remember what order I want to use them in. You also have a custom one here you can use too, and a lot of times I use that for if the game's out of hand and I just want to put in a group of guys, my third stringers, then I'll have this set to like my third string, so that if the game is a blowout one way or the other, then I'll just put my subs in and use them. Another consideration that I always think of in terms of manually subbing is trying to substitute by position. And this is only because I'm an old guy, because in terms of when a player is on the court, typically X is point guard, circle is shooting guard, square is small forward, triangle is power forward. So with those buttons in mind, if I put Wesley Matthews at shooting guard, I know he's circle. If I always use him at shooting guard, he's always circle. But if I put him in at small forward sometimes, then I got to remember that he's square. So for me specifically, I have a little harder time substituting out of a position. If you're a younger guy, a little bit better at that than I am, then it won't be as much of a concern. But I just mention it because it's kind of important to substitute people in positions that you'll remember what button they are, just as a tip. Another thing you want to think about when you're manually subbing is if you get somebody that gets really hot during the game. I know there's been cases before that I've got players like Oladipo or Tyreek Evans or CJ Miles in certain games where they're just hitting everything and you want to leave them in. So even though you might have a set rotation, you're going to decide to leave somebody in a little longer to kind of keep that hot streak going. So just keep that in mind when you're subbing. You don't necessarily have to keep a hard and fast rule when you're going to take somebody out. If somebody's playing well, go ahead and leave them in there a little longer and see if you can really milk that situation for more. One other factor in manually subbing, especially like if you're in a My League file and you're going over the course of a season, is some of the guys that don't play very often, you're going to want to get them into the game, particularly if they get unhappy that they're not playing. Like in another My League file I've got, one guy's morale was going down, and so what I decided to do was to kind of swap him minutes with a guy who is also kind of a deep rotational guy down at the bottom of the rotation that I don't care so much if they get minutes, but I do want to kind of give them minutes to kind of keep them in tune with the team. And it's not such a big deal if you're just playing one game, but if you're playing a season, you're going to want to kind of involve your deep bench guys to help your chemistry and your morale a little bit. Plus you get a chance to kind of liven up your bench a little bit by bringing somebody in who just was because you decided to do it or because somebody got injured. You're going to need to kind of keep that stuff in mind. All right, so these are some tips if you're a manual subber to kind of make it easier for you. And the first one is just to plot out your rotations. Now, I have the rotation timeline loaded up on the screen here, so you can see kind of how to plot out rotations if you wanted to do it on paper outside of the game. Now, this rotation timeline is more for the CPU to control, so if you're going to do manual sub, you kind of need to plot this stuff out on your own. But it's a good idea to kind of plot out your rotations, and this is kind of how it would look if you wanted to do that kind of on your own outside of the game to prepare you to manually sub, is to plot out when you want to put people in, and this is kind of what it would look like. Okay, the next thing you're going to want to do is just go into Play Now or something and just start working with the substitution menu to kind of get used to how to manually sub players in and out. And don't worry so much about whether you're winning the game or not. That way when you get in the game, like if I want to sub on the fly here, I can put Joseph in. Or if I want to put in the starters, or if I want to put in another lineup that I've preset, I already know how to do that, and I'm not learning how to do that during the game. So another thing about it is that when you learn to sub on the fly, you don't have to pause the game, which is annoying to your opponent, because you want to stick to either manually subbing on the fly or during timeout. So like here, if I want to call timeout, in addition to getting used to the on the fly manually subbing, I'm also going to want to get used to how the controls work inside of the timeout. And that way I can decide how I want to do it. And also the on the fly lineups are listed here if I want to do something quickly, just to make it easy and convenient. But go into both the on the fly during a game and also within the timeout screen, and just learn how to execute these substitutions quickly so that you don't have to pause the game for your opponent. Just know how to sub. And I know I mentioned it earlier, that's where these on the fly lineups, customizing them to how it might make it easier to substitute on the fly, would come in handy during the game. If you know you're never going to use the quick lineup, for example, and you want to set that to a certain rotation that you know you want to come in at a certain time, this is a good way to kind of utilize that feature to make it easier to do it on the fly. Now let's talk a little bit more about the auto subbing features of the game. Now that we've covered manually subbing pretty well, if you're going to go on auto, here's a few things that I would suggest as far as in the coach settings. The first is the substitution method. You have two choices there, rotation or fatigue, and I would set that to rotation. From year to year, fatigue sometimes works well, sometimes doesn't. So I think by going by rotation and kind of setting up predetermined minutes, that's important. And I'd also set timeouts to auto, or at least make sure you call timeouts so that the players have a chance to come in. If you set it to auto, then the CPU is going to automatically call a timeout to maybe make a sub. And if you don't, sometimes you'll see the players lining up on the side over there to come in if there's not a break in play. It's just kind of a good practice. Make sure you're using timeouts both on auto and on manual because it's important in the game. Now, as far as giving minutes to your bench players, I like to do a couple of different things here. The first is sometimes if I've seen the real life game and I'm playing the game after the real life game, I'll just go in and I'll assign the players the minutes that they got in the real life game and just put those minutes in here, and that's what I'll use for the game. So for example, if Holiday didn't play, he wouldn't get any minutes. If Oladipo played 36 minutes, well then that's what I would put in the rotations as far as the number of minutes that he would get. The other thing you can do is you can use the suggested minutes that they provide on the side, or you can just kind of come up with your own philosophy. I do like to put my 6-man here no matter how many minutes I give them, and then I like to organize it by minutes down below. But I give them a certain number of minutes. Now, while you can use the rotation timeline to kind of divvy out the minutes when you want, this interface is kind of cumbersome to use, and if you're adept at using it and you want to get in there and kind of fine-tune when everybody comes in and when everybody leaves, then that's great, because it'll give you a little bit more control over when people are going to come in, and maybe you want a certain unit playing it together or a certain unit playing at the end of the game. Then the computer will do it for you kind of automatically as the game goes on. There are also 3 settings within the coach profile that are kind of important to auto subbing. The first is bench depth, and you notice it's set to 10 here. A lot of times, based on information I've read on some forums, it's a good idea to set that maybe to 1 more player than you're actually going to play. So if you're going to go 9 deep, you put 10 in bench depth. If you're going to have 10 players playing, then you put 11 there. And then I often leave these at default, but if I don't leave them at default, what I do instead is I put the bench utilization to 100 and the lineup performance factor to 0. And I think these are actually reversed from how you would think they would be. And what this would do is make sure that if somebody's hot, they're going to get a few more minutes, that the bench is going to get in there when it's supposed to. And the one thing that I like about the lineup performance factor is if somebody does get going, they'll play a little longer than what you would normally expect based on their minutes. Not a whole lot, but it does have a little bit of an impact. Now, just because you set the minutes to be exactly these number of minutes doesn't mean that if you use auto subs, that's exactly what they're going to get. It's going to be more or less kind of in the area, and it does a pretty good job of getting people in or out. And so it's a good way to kind of go about it if you want to auto sub your way through the game. Now, there are some drawbacks to using auto subs. The first drawback that I always notice is, in particular, you're playing the Hall of Fame CPU, is you get somebody going and then the Hall of Fame CPU will call timeout, and then when you know it, that guy that was hot, he's not out there anymore. So it can work against you sometimes. If you got somebody that's hot and you want to leave them out there, keep playing, a manual sub in that situation is going to give you the best opportunity to keep somebody hot on the floor. The other thing is that the CPU on auto subs doesn't always recognize foul trouble or matchup problems, or if you don't call timeout, maybe to get somebody in there, if you got it on manual timeouts and you're not calling timeout, the CPU is going to foul sometimes just to get a stoppage in play, so that guys will come in. I've noticed it's probably not necessarily that way, but it seems like it kind of works out that way. If the game wants to get somebody in there, there's going to be a stoppage of play either through a turnover or through a foul. So when the situation's critical, you want to make sure that you've called timeout. That way they're not trying to bring somebody in a situation at a key point of the game and create a problem for you during the game that you wouldn't have otherwise had. All right, so we went in depth in the difference between the auto subs, the manual subs, and how to kind of handle things in certain situations using either one of those methods. Now that we know that, well, which one should you use? Well, the first thing I'm going to suggest is that it's good to play a longer game. So if you're playing a 12-minute quarter game, this is when this stuff really matters, because your bench, you got to use your bench. You may run into foul trouble. People may get tired. And if you're playing a shorter game, it don't matter. So I guess if you're not playing a longer game, then I wouldn't worry so much about auto subbing and manually subbing. But that being said, if you're new to the game, I would start with auto subs till you get familiar with how to play. And once you're decent, then dive deeper into playing people when you want to play them. If you have a tough time kind of manipulating the controls to get people in when you need them on the fly, and you've got to pause it during the game and potentially annoy an opponent because you're over there manually subbing during situations during the game, and you got to pause to do that stuff, then I would stick to auto subs so you don't annoy your opponents. Now, ideally, if you can manually sub, that would be great, because it's probably more of a sim way to play, to manually control everything and letting the CPU do it. And you have a lot more control over the team that way and leave a lot less to the CPU to decide. Because there are times when you're on auto subs, you'll have you want somebody in there, and if you're manually subbing, you won't have that feeling, so it won't nag at you like that. So, but neither one's really better. If you're going to use auto subs, what I would suggest is you go in and you kind of assign who you want to play. And if you want to use the rotation timeline and get in there and kind of decide, all right, these are the people I wanted to play and when, well, that brings you a lot closer to the manual world and makes it a little bit more of a better game experience for you. Now, personally, I use auto subs most of the time, and there are times when I use manual subs here and there. So it just depends on the game situation, but the vast majority of the time I use auto subs. But I've gone in there and I've kind of decided who's going to play how many minutes and kind of have some control over what's going to happen in terms of substitutions. All right, well, those are my thoughts on auto subs versus manual subs. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Are you a person that uses auto subs, or are you a person that uses manual subs? And let me know why down in the comments. And if you got any other suggestions that I didn't mention, please let us know, so we'll have it here underneath the video. All right, I am Coach 2K. I'll see you on the court for the next video, and thanks for watching.